In the frozen silence of Red Square at dawn. The year is 1985, and the massive red banners still flutter above the mausoleum, where Lenin's preserved body lies in eternal watch. The wind carries the faint metallic clang of distant trams, and the low murmur of early commuters shuffling through snow that has not been cleared in days. No one yet whispers the word collapse, yet the colossal economic machine that once powered an empire from the Baltic to the Pacific is already beginning to seize. This was the Soviet command economy, a system engineered with iron certainty to surpass every rival on Earth. A vast network of state-owned factories, collective farms, and central planners who believed they could bend human effort and natural resources into a perfect, unbreakable whole. For 7 decades it had defined the 20th century, promising bread, steel, and equality in exchange for obedience and sacrifice. Yet beneath the surface of parades and production quotas, the first tremors were already traveling through the system's veins. The collapse did not begin with chaos or revolution. It began quietly, in the growing gap between official statistics glowing on Politburo charts and the empty shelves that greeted workers every morning. By the time the signs became unmistakable, the machinery designed to last forever had already started to die from within, and no decree from Moscow could revive it. The roots of this ambitious experiment stretched back to the smoke-filled rooms of 1917, when Bolshevik revolutionaries seized the palaces and declared that private property and market chaos would be replaced by scientific planning for the common good. Under Stalin, the system was hammered into shape through 5-year plans that turned a peasant nation into an industrial colossus, factories rising overnight in the Urals, entire cities built around steel mills and hydroelectric dams whose turbines thrummed day and night. After the devastation of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union emerged as one of 2 global superpowers, its economy seemingly invincible, its people taught from childhood that central planning had conquered hunger, illiteracy, and unemployment forever. In the 1950s and 1960s, the state delivered Sputniks into orbit, apartments to millions, and a sense of historic destiny that echoed in every classroom and factory loudspeaker. Citizens learned to measure progress not by profit, but by tons of coal mined, hectares of wheat sown, and the steady hand of Gosplan officials in Moscow who allocated every nail, every tractor, every kilowatt of electricity according to the greater plan. The system appeared eternal, a rational alternative to the booms and busts of the capitalist West, and the world watched with a mixture of awe and dread as the red flag flew over half the planet's landmass. Life inside this planned world followed rhythms as predictable as the seasons. In a typical Leningrad apartment block, at 7 in the morning, the radio broadcast the latest harvest figures, while families queued for black bread and sour milk at the state shop on the corner. The smell of boiled cabbage and cheap tobacco lingered in the stairwells, where neighbors exchanged cautious gossip about shortages that were never mentioned in Pravda. Men in padded jackets trudged to the Kirov factory, where the roar of lathes and the hiss of welding torches filled the air, each worker assigned a precise quota by distant planners who had never seen the rust forming on the machines. Women balanced shopping bags and children, moving through a city where every price was fixed, every job guaranteed, and every ambition channeled through the party. In the evenings, families gathered around flickering televisions to watch state-approved programs celebrating record tractor production, while outside the windows, the same gray streets stretched under the same gray sky. The routine felt solid, almost comforting in its sameness, a world without the fear of sudden layoffs or inflation that haunted the West. Yet even in these ordinary days, small fractures were appearing. A tractor factory in Kharkov quietly missing its target by 12%. A collective farm in Kazakhstan reporting phantom grain yields to avoid punishment. A shop manager in Novosibirsk hiding better goods under the counter for favored customers. No one called these failures yet. They were simply temporary difficulties to be overcome by greater effort. The invisible warning signs first appeared in the late 1960s, when the easy gains of post-war reconstruction began to fade. Growth rates that had once reached double digits slowed to a crawl, hidden behind optimistic official reports that spoke of steady progress while actual productivity stagnated. Factories received the same orders year after year, producing the same models of shoes and refrigerators that no one wanted, because innovation was risky and unprofitable under the plan. Managers hoarded raw materials out of fear of future shortages, creating artificial bottlenecks that rippled across the entire economy. Workers learned the quiet art of storming, rushing to meet quotas only in the final weeks of each quarter, while the rest of the time machines stood idle. Corruption seeped into the system like water into cracks in concrete. Party officials traded favors for scarce goods. Black market networks flourished in the shadows of state warehouses. And the gap between rhetoric and reality widened until it could no longer be ignored by those who lived it daily. The oil boom of the 1970s temporarily masked the decay, flooding the country with hard currency that paid for imported grain and consumer luxuries. But it also created a dangerous dependence on a single commodity whose price was set far beyond Soviet borders. Still, the planners in Moscow adjusted the numbers, issued new directives, and assured the people that socialism was advancing according to plan. The warnings remained invisible to the outside world, and even to many inside it, because acknowledging them would mean questioning the entire foundation on which the state rested. By the early 1980s, tension had become palpable, even if it still lacked a name. In the coal mines of Donbass, workers began to speak openly about impossible norms and broken safety equipment, while supervisors looked the other way. In the shops of Moscow and Kiev, lines for meat and butter stretched for blocks, people stamping their feet in the cold, clutching ration coupons that grew thinner each month. The sound of empty shelves being restocked with nothing but canned fish became a grim national joke, whispered behind closed doors. Agricultural output, once the pride of collective farms, now required massive imports to prevent outright famine. The war in Afghanistan drained resources and morale, sending young men home in zinc coffins while the economy groaned under the weight of military spending that consumed a quarter of the national budget. Factories continued to belch smoke, but the goods they produced piled up in warehouses because quality had become irrelevant to the quota system. Citizens developed a second economy of favors, barter, and quiet theft. The state responded with slogans and minor reforms. But the machinery of planning had grown too rigid, too vast, too disconnected from the daily realities of human effort and natural limits. The system was still standing, yet it was running on borrowed time and borrowed oil. The key decisions that accelerated the crisis came with the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. A younger, energetic leader, he inherited an economy already wheezing and chose two words that would prove fatal: Perestroika and glasnost. Restructuring and openness were meant to breathe life into the dying plan, allowing limited private enterprise and honest discussion of problems long denied. Factories were told they could respond to demand instead of quotas alone. Newspapers began to print stories of waste and inefficiency that had once been state secrets, and the people suddenly heard truths they had suspected for years. The intention was salvation, not destruction. Yet the reforms unleashed forces the planners had never anticipated. Corruption that had been hidden now appeared in the open. Shortages that had been endured in silence became public scandals. The oil price collapse of 1986 slashed hard currency earnings overnight, exposing the economy's dangerous reliance on a single export. Chernobyl in the same year revealed not only technological failure, but the rot of secrecy and incompetence at the highest levels. Gorbachev's attempts to re-centralize control while simultaneously loosening it created a fatal contradiction. The old system lost its authority without a new one taking its place. The machine that had once moved in perfect lockstep now lurched in conflicting directions, and the first serious cracks turned into visible fissures. Pressures from every direction mounted relentlessly, the war in Afghanistan became an unwinnable drain on both treasury and prestige. Eastern European satellites, long subsidized by Moscow, began to demand economic independence as their own planned economies faltered. Inside the Soviet republics, long suppressed nationalist grievances found voice once glasnost removed the muzzle of fear. Food production continued to fall, while the population, grown accustomed to subsidized bread, grew restless. The ruble, once stable by decree, began to lose its value on the black market, as citizens hoarded dollars and gold. Factories that had operated for decades without competition now faced the impossible task of becoming efficient overnight. Decisions made in panic, printing more money to cover deficits, loosening price controls without market mechanisms, only deepened the chaos. By 1989, the system was no longer merely strained, it was hemorrhaging. Empty store shelves became the defining image of daily life, and the once unquestioned authority of the Communist Party began to dissolve in the face of public anger and elite cynicism. The moment the system began to fail was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by the slow, irreversible realization that the plan itself had become the problem. The human consequences arrived with brutal suddenness once the illusion of control evaporated. In the winter of 1990 to 1991, families stood in lines for hours, only to be told the shop had nothing left but vinegar and matches. Pensioners who had built the Soviet dream now rummaged through garbage for scraps. Young engineers who once dreamed of building the future sold their skills on street corners or emigrated if they could. The proud working class that had been told it owned the means of production watched factories close or be stripped for parts by insiders. Black market prices soared, while state wages remained frozen, creating a nightmare of inflation without the word being officially admitted. Hospitals ran out of medicine, schools went unheated, and the silence of broken elevators in apartment blocks became a daily reminder that the state could no longer deliver even the basics it had promised for 70 years. Fear replaced certainty. People who had never known unemployment now faced it, and those who had never questioned the system now questioned everything. The social fabric that had been held together by shared ideology and state provision began to fray at the edges, then tear down the middle. Social breakdown followed as inevitably as night follows the fading of the last factory lights. Strikes paralyzed the coal mines of Vorkuta and the railroads of Siberia, halting what little remained of supply chains. In the republics, ethnic tensions that had been suppressed for generations erupted into open conflict as central authority weakened. In Moscow itself, the August 1991 coup attempt by hardliners, desperate to save the old order, collapsed in 3 days, its failure broadcast live on television sets across the Union. The Communist Party, once omnipotent, was banned. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin on Christmas Day 1991, and the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. What had been a single economic colossus splintered into 15 independent states, each inheriting pieces of a broken machine and the debts it had accumulated. Millions lost savings overnight in the chaos of currency reform. Organized crime filled the vacuum left by the retreating state. The proud symbols of industrial power, giant steel plants, collective farms, research institutes, stood idle or were sold for scrap to whoever could pay in hard currency. The system that had once commanded the loyalty of 300 million people had dissolved into memory and ruin almost overnight. The long-term historical impact reshaped the entire global order in ways few had predicted. The end of the command economy marked the close of the Cold War, the triumph of market forces, and the beginning of an era of globalization that reached every corner of the planet. Russia and the former republics staggered through the painful transition to capitalism, enduring hyperinflation, oligarchic privatization, and a collapse in living standards that rivaled the Great Depression. Entire industries vanished. Populations shrank through emigration and declining birth rates, and the once feared Soviet military rusted in its bases. Yet the lessons traveled far beyond the borders of the former Union. Economists and policymakers worldwide studied the failure of central planning with forensic intensity, using it as proof that markets, however imperfect, could allocate resources with an efficiency no committee could match. New nations rewrote their constitutions around private property and competition. International institutions promoted liberalization as the only path forward. The Soviet collapse became the definitive case study of an economic system that could not survive its own contradictions, a monument to the limits of human design when it ignores the stubborn realities of incentives, information, and innovation. Even today, the ghosts of that failed system linger in the skeletal remains of factories across the former Soviet lands, in the faded slogans still visible on crumbling walls, and in the cautious way modern leaders speak of state control versus market freedom. The silence that settled over the planned economy after 1991 carries a warning that echoes across time. No matter how grand the blueprint, how noble the intention, or how absolute the power, an economic system that cannot adapt, that cannot listen to the signals sent by millions of ordinary lives, will eventually reach the point where repair is no longer possible. The machinery stops not with a bang, but with the quiet turning off of the final switch. The last quota left unfilled, the last promise left unkept. What remains is not merely an empire in ruins, but a profound reminder that the forces holding any economy together are more fragile than they appear, and that the moment of irreversible rupture often arrives long before anyone is willing to admit it has begun. The story of the Soviet command economy is not just the tale of one nation's fall. It is the tale of how even the most carefully constructed systems can prove in the end that they simply could not survive.